There is a cliff face in southern Iran that has been staring down at the living for over 2,500 years. It rises from the flat earth like a wall the sky forgot to finish. And carved into it, not painted, not scratched, but cut deep into the rock itself, are the tombs of four Achaemenid kings: Darius the Great, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Darius II, men who once commanded armies so large that historians still argue about the numbers, men who built roads across continents and bent the ancient world to their will. And when they died, they chose this cliff, not a valley, not a city, this specific cliff, in this specific place, for reasons that archaeologists are still, quietly, debating. The site is called Naqsh-e Rustam. The name translates roughly to Picture of Rustam, a reference to the Persian mythological hero that locals in the medieval period believed was depicted in the carvings. They were wrong about that, but the name stuck anyway, the way names tend to do when a place is old enough that nobody remembers who named it first. What we know for certain is this: the cliff at Naqsh-e Rustam was not chosen casually. The Achaemenid kings, who ruled Persia from roughly 550 to 330 BCE, were not people who made careless decisions about where to put things. These were administrators, builders, men who coordinated the construction of Persepolis, one of the most sophisticated palace complexes the ancient world had ever seen, just a few miles away. When they picked this cliff for their eternal resting place, there was a reason, possibly several reasons, and those reasons connect directly to something older, something that was already at Naqsh-e Rustam, long before the first Achaemenid king ever set eyes on it. Because here is where the story gets interesting. Cut into the lower section of that same cliff, partly obscured now by the later royal tombs above it, is a much older relief carving. Scholars refer to it as the Elamite relief. The Elamites were a civilization that preceded the Persians in this region by well over 1,000 years. They carved figures into that rock, performed rituals at that site, and considered it, by all the evidence we have, sacred ground. So when Darius the Great chose Naqsh-e Rustam for his tomb, he wasn't just picking a dramatic backdrop. He was deliberately associating himself with a place that already carried the weight of deep, ancient reverence. He was borrowing something, legitimacy maybe, or power, or both. That kind of layering, one civilization building on top of another's sacred space, is something you see again and again in the ancient world. But at Naqsh-e Rustam, it's unusually transparent. You can literally see the older carvings beneath the newer ones. The timeline is written into the rock itself. Now, in front of the cliff, standing in the open ground, there is a square stone tower. It's called the Kaaba-i-Zartosht, which translates loosely to Cube of Zoroaster. It's roughly 14 meters tall, built from white limestone, and it is almost perfectly preserved. Nobody knows exactly what it was for. That is not an exaggeration or a dramatic flourish. It is a genuine, documented gap in our understanding. Was it a fire temple, a treasury, a place where sacred texts were kept? All three theories have serious scholars behind them. None of them has been definitively proven, and that tower has been standing there, in front of those royal tombs, for somewhere between 2,400 and 2,600 years, keeping whatever secret it holds. The Selka stone settlement framework places Naqsh-e Rustam in a specific category, sites where stone was used not merely for construction, but for deliberate layered communication across time. The cliff face functions almost like a bulletin board for power. Each king who added his tomb there was making a statement to every generation that followed, and the Elamite carvings underneath were making a statement to the kings themselves. We were here first. This place is old. Respect it. What we cannot yet answer is the deeper question underneath all of that. Why this cliff specifically? There are other cliffs in the region, other dramatic rock faces. What made this one the one? Was it purely visual? Was there a water source nearby that's since dried up? Was there something about the orientation? The way it faces, the way the light hits it at certain times of year? Those questions remain open, and in some ways, that's exactly the point. Stone endures, but it doesn't always explain itself. There is a small town in north-central Turkey, sitting quietly in the middle of Anatolia, that most people outside of archaeology have never heard of. It doesn't have the name recognition of Troy. It doesn't pull the tourist numbers that Ephesus does. But what was pulled out of the ground there, starting in the late 19th century and continuing for decades after, forced historians to push back their understanding of early Anatolian civilization by several hundred years. The site is called Alacahöyük, and the stone gate foundations at its entrance are, in the most precise sense of the word, extraordinary. The gates themselves, what remains of them, date to the Hittite period, roughly 1400 to 1200 BCE. The Hittites were a Bronze Age empire that controlled much of Anatolia and the northern Levant at their peak, powerful enough to go toe-to-toe with Egypt and sign what is considered the world's earliest surviving peace treaty after the Battle of Kadesh. These were not a minor people. They built in stone with serious intention, and the sphinxes that flanked the gate at Alacahöyük, massive, carved figures with human heads and lion bodies, were designed to project exactly the kind of authority you'd expect from an empire that negotiated with pharaohs. But here is what the sphinxes are hiding, in a manner of speaking. Beneath the Hittite construction, the excavations at Alacahöyük revealed something much older, royal tombs from what archaeologists call the early Bronze Age, dating back to roughly 2350 to 2150 BCE. These pre-Hittite burials contained gold, silver, electrum, and bronze objects of remarkable sophistication, sun discs, ritual standards, figures of stags and bulls that show a level of metallurgical skill that nobody expected to find in Anatolia that early. The people who made these objects are not definitively identified even now. They predate the Hittites by nearly 1,000 years. They were building and burying and creating at a level that simply wasn't supposed to exist in that region at that time, according to the historical models that were in place before the excavations began. So what you have at Alacahöyük is a site with at least two distinct civilizational layers, each one remarkable on its own terms, stacked on top of each other in the same patch of Anatolian ground. And the stone gate foundations sit right at the intersection of those two worlds. The visible Hittite architecture built directly above and around the older sacred burial ground beneath. The Selka stone settlement classification of this site focuses specifically on those gate foundations and what they represent structurally. The foundation stones are not decorative. They are load-bearing, carefully fitted, and positioned with a precision that reflects serious engineering knowledge. The Sphinx Gate was not just an entrance, it was a threshold, a deliberate boundary between the ordinary world outside and whatever the Hittites considered sacred or protected within. That concept of the threshold, the marked boundary built from stone, shows up at multiple sites in the Selka framework, and Alacahöyük is one of the clearest examples of it anywhere in the ancient Near East. What remains genuinely unresolved is the relationship between the Hittite builders and the Bronze Age burials beneath them. Did the Hittites know what was under the ground when they built there? Almost certainly yes. Bronze Age burial mounds are not subtle features in a landscape. Did they build there because of what was already there? That is a much harder question. Some researchers argue that the Hittites deliberately chose the site to inherit the sacred authority of the earlier culture. Others suggest the location was chosen for purely practical or geographical reasons, and the older tombs were essentially irrelevant to the decision. The honest answer is that we don't know. The written record the Hittites left behind, substantial as it is, they were prolific record keepers on clay tablets, does not address Alacahöyük specifically in ways that resolve this question. The stone speaks more clearly than the texts do in this case. There is one more detail worth sitting with. The sphinxes at the gate are not originals. The originals were removed during excavation and are now split between two museums, one in Ankara, one in Berlin. What stands at the site today are reproductions, which means the gate, as visitors see it now, is itself a kind of reconstruction, a copy of a threshold that was built above a world that was already ancient when the Hittites arrived. Layers beneath layers, stone beneath stone. That pattern, it turns out, is only getting started. Sometime around 1902, a construction crew in the town of Paola, on the small Mediterranean island of Malta, was digging foundations for a new housing development. Routine work, the kind of thing that happens in growing towns without much ceremony. And then one of their tools broke through into something below, a hollow space. Then another, then a network of chambers carved entirely out of living rock, descending in 3 distinct levels into the earth beneath them. The workers, by most accounts, kept quiet about it for several years. The full scope of what they had found didn't reach archaeologists until around 1907. By that point, some of the upper chambers had already been disturbed. What remained, however, was enough to stop the archaeological community cold. The site is called the Ħal Saflieni Hypogeum. The word hypogeum simply means underground structure in Greek, but that word does almost nothing to prepare you for what the place actually is. This is not a cave. It is not a natural formation that people later adapted. Every chamber, every corridor, every curved ceiling and carved niche in the Ħal Saflieni Hypogeum was cut by human hands, using tools made of stone and bone and antler, somewhere between 3,600 and 2,500 BCE. That places its construction before Stonehenge, before the pyramids at Giza, before most of the structures that tend to anchor our mental picture of the ancient world. The 3 levels descend to about 10 meters below the surface. The uppermost level appears to be the oldest, carved into natural cave formations that were then expanded and refined. The middle level is where the craftsmanship becomes, frankly, startling. Chambers here were cut with a precision and deliberateness that goes well beyond functional necessity. One room in particular, called the Oracle Room, has an acoustic property that researchers have spent considerable effort studying. A low male voice, spoken or chanted from a specific niche in that room, resonates through the entire hypogeum at a frequency of around 110 Hz. The sound doesn't just echo, it fills the space in a way that is, by multiple accounts from people who have experienced it firsthand, physically felt as much as heard. Was that intentional? Did the builders of the Ħal Saflieni Hypogeum design the Oracle Room specifically to produce that acoustic effect? That is not a question with a clean answer. Some acoustic archaeologists argue yes, that the 110 Hz frequency was deliberately engineered, possibly to induce specific neurological states during ritual use. Research has shown that sound at that frequency can affect brain activity, producing responses in the areas associated with altered consciousness and deep memory. Others are more cautious, noting that we cannot confirm intentionality without written or pictorial evidence that the builders understood what they were creating. The Maltese temple builders left no written language. Their intentions have to be inferred entirely from what they built. What we do know is that the hypogeum was used for a significant period as a burial site. The remains of approximately 7,000 individuals were found across its chambers. 7,000. On an island that, at the time of the hypogeum's use, had a total population that was almost certainly far smaller than that number suggests. The dead were placed here over generations, possibly centuries, in what appears to have been an organized and deliberate funerary practice. Ochre, red pigment, was found on many of the remains and on the chamber walls. Figurines were found, including one of the most debated objects in Maltese archaeology, a small, sleeping figure, often called the Sleeping Lady, whose posture and craftsmanship suggest a ritual significance that nobody has fully explained. The Selka stone settlement framework positions the Ħal Saflieni Hypogeum as one of the most significant examples of intentional subterranean stone shaping in the ancient world. Not because it is the largest, it isn't, but because the relationship between the space, the stone, the sound, and the dead who were placed there suggests a coherent worldview being expressed in 3 dimensions: underground, in the dark. These were not people simply disposing of their dead. They were constructing an architecture of belief, and they were doing it in stone, beneath the earth, in a way that was meant to last. It has lasted 5,000 years and counting. What remains unanswered is the larger question of the culture that built it. The Maltese temple builders appear, and then, around 2500 BCE, disappear from the archaeological record with an abruptness that is itself unexplained. No clear evidence of invasion. No obvious environmental catastrophe on the scale that would account for it. They built something extraordinary, and then they were simply gone. There is a hill in Aberdeenshire, in the northeast of Scotland, that on a clear day gives you a view stretching for miles in every direction. The hill is called Tapo Noth. It rises to about 563 meters above sea level, which in Scottish terms is not exceptional. There are higher hills, more dramatic hills. But Tapo Noth has something on its summit that very few hills anywhere in the world can claim. The remains of a vitrified hillfort, a stone structure so intensely heated at some point in its history that the rock itself melted and fused together into a glassy, slag-like mass. And recent excavations have revealed that what sits beneath and within that vitrified outer wall is one of the largest prehistoric hill forts ever identified in Scotland, possibly in all of Northern Europe. The numbers, when they came in, genuinely surprised the archaeologists running the dig. The excavation that brought Tapo Noth back into serious academic focus was led by a team from the University of Aberdeen, with results published around 2020 and 2021. Using a combination of traditional excavation and modern survey techniques, they identified evidence of around 4,000 pit houses, structures dug partially into the ground and covered with organic roofing material, clustered on and around the hill fort. 4,000. If that number holds up under further analysis and researchers are still working through the implications, Tapo Noth was not a small defensive outpost or a seasonal gathering place. It was, at least at some point in its history, a substantial settlement, a community large enough that calling it a town, by the standards of its era, is not unreasonable. The dating is where things get complicated and genuinely interesting. The vitrified wall, that fused, glassy outer fortification, appears to date to the Iron Age, roughly the first millennium BCE. But some of the evidence from the pit houses suggests activity at the site stretching back considerably further. The full chronology of Tapo Noth is still being assembled, and it is likely to take years of additional work before the picture is clear. What researchers are already confident about is that this site was used, returned to, and built upon across a significant span of time. It was not a single-moment construction. It grew, it changed, and at some point, something happened to its outer wall that subjected the stone to temperatures high enough to cause vitrification. That last point is worth slowing down on. Vitrified forts are found at roughly 50 sites across Scotland and a handful of other locations in Europe. The vitrification is real and documented. The stone genuinely melted. What is not agreed upon is how or why. The two main explanations that have been seriously debated among researchers are these. First, that the vitrification was accidental, the result of the fort being set on fire by attackers, with the timber laced through the stone walls, burning hot enough and long enough to melt the rock. Second, that the vitrification was intentional, that the builders themselves set fire to the walls deliberately, possibly to strengthen the structure, possibly for ritual reasons, possibly both. The problem with the first theory is a structural one. Experiments attempting to replicate accidental vitrification through attack fires have generally struggled to produce the sustained, even temperatures that the actual vitrified forts display. The problem with the second theory is the obvious question it raises. Why would you deliberately destroy the integrity of your own defensive wall, even partially? And what would the ritual logic behind such an act look like? Neither explanation has been definitively ruled out, and there is a third possibility that some researchers have raised more quietly, that the vitrification occurred not during the life of the fort, but after its abandonment, for reasons that had nothing to do with the original inhabitants. That theory has its own problems, not least the question of who would have bothered. The Selka stone settlement classification of Tapo Noth focuses on the stone core of the Hillfort structure, the foundation and inner construction that predates or underlies the vitrified outer wall. That core represents a level of organized labor and site planning that, given the scale now emerging from the excavations, was considerably more sophisticated than the site's relatively obscure reputation would suggest. Scotland has no shortage of prehistoric monuments, but Tapo Noth, sitting on its windy summit in Aberdeenshire, keeps producing evidence that pushes the boundaries of what we assumed about the scale and complexity of Iron Age and pre-Iron Age communities in northern Britain. 4,000 pit houses on a Scottish hilltop. That is not a footnote. That is a city waiting to be understood. There is a place in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta Mountains of northern Colombia that the outside world did not know existed until 1972. And even then, the people who found it first were not archaeologists, they were looters. A group of treasure hunters working their way through dense jungle came across stone terraces emerging from the hillside, connected by ancient stairways, partially consumed by centuries of vegetation. They pulled artifacts from the site and began selling them on the black market in Santa Marta. The objects were unusual enough and valuable enough that word eventually reached Colombian authorities and then archaeologists. By 1976, a formal excavation was underway. What they found was a city, not a ceremonial outpost, not a seasonal camp. A city built on a steep jungle mountainside, covering roughly 30 hectares, with hundreds of terrace platforms connected by a network of stone paths and stairways. The local indigenous people, the Kogi, already knew it was there. They had always known. They called it Teyuna. The name Ciudad Perdida, the lost city, came later from the outside world that had simply failed to look. The lower terraces at Ciudad Perdida are where much of the most significant structural evidence sits, and they are the focus of the Selcha stone settlement classification of this site. These terraces were not carved from the mountain passively. They represent an enormous and sustained engineering effort, stone retaining walls built to hold flat platforms against a slope that drops sharply through tropical rainforest toward the Buritaca River below. The precision of the construction matters here. These walls were built without mortar. The stones were shaped and fitted against each other in a way that has allowed them to withstand centuries of heavy rainfall, root intrusion, seismic activity, and the relentless biological pressure of one of the most aggressive ecosystems on Earth. Many of them are still structurally sound today. The builders were the Tairona people, a civilization that flourished in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta from at least the first millennium CE. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the site places the construction of Ciudad Perdida at around 800 CE, though some researchers believe activity in the area began earlier. The Tairona were sophisticated in ways that their relative obscurity in popular history doesn't reflect. They built extensive road networks through the mountains. They managed water through a system of drainage channels integrated into their terraced construction. They maintained trade relationships with other cultures across the region. And they built their primary city not in a valley or on a coast where access would be easy, but high in a mountain range that required days of difficult travel to reach even today, with marked trails and modern gear. Why there? That question sits at the center of what makes Ciudad Perdida genuinely puzzling as a settlement choice. The Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta is not an easy place to live. The lower terraces in particular, despite their engineering quality, occupy terrain that demanded constant maintenance against the jungle's efforts to reclaim them. The Tairona clearly had both the labor force and the organizational capacity to build almost anywhere in their territory. They chose the high mountains. The prevailing explanation among researchers is defensive, that the elevation and the difficulty of access provided natural protection. But the Kogui, the descendants of the Tairona who still live in the Sierra Nevada today, offer a different framing. For them, Teyuna is not primarily a defensive site. It is a sacred one. The Sierra Nevada is, in their cosmology, the heart of the world. Building there was not a strategic calculation. It was an obligation. That tension between the archaeological interpretation and the indigenous understanding of the same place is one that runs through the Ciudad Perdida literature and has no clean resolution. Both frameworks contain real information. They just organize it differently. What the lower terraces show, structurally and materially, is a community that understood its landscape with extraordinary intimacy. The drainage systems built into the terrace walls account for the specific rainfall patterns of the Sierra Nevada in ways that suggest generations of observation and accumulated knowledge translated directly into construction decisions. This was not trial and error building. This was informed, deliberate engineering rooted in deep environmental knowledge. The Spanish conquest disrupted the Tirona catastrophically in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Ciudad Perdida was abandoned. The jungle moved in quickly, as jungle does, but the lower terraces held. Stone fitted against stone, without mortar, on a steep Colombian mountainside for over 1,000 years. The jungle never fully won. There is a bend in the Usumacinta River, on the border between what is now southern Mexico and Guatemala, where the jungle comes down hard to the water's edge on both sides, and the air sits heavy and green and close. In that bend, on the Mexican side, the ancient Maya city of Yaxchilan occupies a limestone promontory that the river wraps around on three sides like a natural moat. To reach it today, you take a boat. You always had to take a boat, or cross at a specific shallow point that the Maya controlled. That geography was not accidental. The people who built Yaxchilan understood exactly what the river gave them, and they built accordingly for centuries. Most visitors who make the journey to Yaxchilan come for the major structures: the main plaza, the grand staircases, the elaborately carved lintels above the doorways of the principal buildings, which are among the finest examples of Maya stone carving anywhere in the world. Those lintels tell stories, dynastic histories, ritual events, the names and deeds of rulers carved with a specificity and artistry that still stops people cold when they stand in front of them. They are remarkable. But the Selka stone settlement framework directs attention elsewhere, at Yaxchilan, to the lesser structures, the smaller buildings scattered across the site's multiple levels, the constructions that receive less scholarly attention and far fewer photographs, but which, taken together, reveal something about how this city actually functioned on a daily basis that the grand monuments don't show you. Yaxchilan was occupied and developed across a long period, with its peak influence running roughly from 250 to 900 CE, during what archaeologists call the Classic Maya period. At its height, it was a regional power, controlling trade along the Usumacinta and maintaining complex political relationships, sometimes alliances, sometimes violent rivalries, with neighboring cities, including Piedras Negras and Palenque. The ruling dynasty that left the most visible mark on the city was associated with a series of kings whose names, reconstructed from the carved inscriptions, include Shield Jaguar the Great and Bird Jaguar the Fourth. These were not ceremonial figureheads. They were active political and military operators whose decisions shaped the city's physical form as much as its political fortunes. The lesser structures at Yaxchilan are distributed across a series of natural and modified terraces that step up from the river level into the higher ground behind. Many of these buildings have not been fully excavated. Some have been stabilized against collapse, but not cleared. Others are still partially buried under centuries of accumulated organic material and root systems. What the work that has been done reveals is a construction vocabulary that is consistent across the site. Limestone blocks cut and fitted with care, corbelled vault roofing systems, doorways oriented with deliberate attention to sight lines and solar events, but applied at varying scales depending on the function and status of each structure. Here is what makes the lesser structures specifically interesting in the context of the Selka framework. The major buildings at a Maya site, like Yaxchilan, were built to impress, to project power, to anchor ritual events that the entire community participated in. Their scale and ornamentation reflect their public function. The lesser structures had different jobs. Some appear to have been residential, housing the intermediate class of administrators, scribes, and craft specialists that kept a city of Yaxchilan's complexity operating. Others show evidence of specialized production or storage. A few have interior arrangements that suggest ritual use at a smaller, possibly more private scale than the grand temple ceremonies conducted in the main plaza. That diversity of function, expressed through variations in the same basic stone construction tradition, is what the Selkirk classification is tracking. The lesser structures are where the texture of daily life at Yaxchilan is most legible, precisely because they weren't built for an audience. They were built to be used. The collapse of Yaxchilan, like the collapse of the broader classic Maya civilization across the lowlands, happened with a speed that still puzzles researchers. By around 900 CE, the city appears to have been largely abandoned. The last dated monument at the site was carved in 808 CE. After that, silence. The theories are familiar from other Maya collapse discussions: prolonged drought, agricultural exhaustion, political fragmentation, warfare. Probably some combination of all of them, in proportions that shifted across different regions and different decades. But here is the question that the lesser structures quietly raise. When the city emptied, where did those people go? The administrators, the craftspeople, the families who lived in those smaller stone buildings on the terraces above the river. There is a site in the Tlacolula Valley of Oaxaca, in southern Mexico, that occupies a rocky hillside above the valley floor with the particular kind of quiet authority that old places sometimes carry. The valley itself is one of the arms of the broader Oaxaca Valley system, a landscape that has supported continuous human settlement for thousands of years and that produced, among other things, the Zapotec civilization, one of the earliest complex societies in Mesoamerica, predating the better-known Aztec and Maya cultures by centuries. The site is called Yagul, and while it contains a substantial archaeological complex, including a ball court, palace structures, and one of the largest group tomb systems in the Oaxaca Valley, the Selkirk stone settlement framework focuses on something more specific: the astronomical orientation evidence embedded in Yagul's stone construction, and what that evidence says about the people who built here and the sky they were watching. Yagul was occupied across a long span, with its most significant development occurring during the late pre-classic and classic periods, roughly 500 BCE to 900 CE, though occupation of the broader area stretches back considerably further. The site sits at an elevation that gives it commanding views of the surrounding valley, and its relationship to the nearby major Zapotec center of Mitla is close enough, geographically and culturally, that the two sites are often discussed together. But Yagul has its own character. It is smaller than the great Zapotec capital of Monte Alban, less visually dramatic than Mitla's famous geometric stone mosaic facades. What it has, and what makes it significant in the context of this series, is a specific and well-documented piece of astronomical architecture that connects it to a tradition of sky observation that runs deep through Zapotec culture. The Zapotec were serious astronomers. That is not a romantic projection. It is documented in their architecture, their calendar systems, and their careful orientation of major structures relative to celestial events. Monte Alban contains a building known as Building J, arrow-shaped and oriented in a way that is clearly non-standard for the site, which researchers have convincingly argued was designed as an astronomical observation point, aligned to specific stellar events. The Zapotec tracked the movements of Venus with particular intensity, and their understanding of the solar year was precise enough to be encoded in the physical layout of their ceremonial centers. At Yagul, the astronomical evidence is expressed differently. The site's principal structures are oriented with attention to solar events and the positioning of specific architectural elements, doorways, sight lines, through aligned openings. The relationship between structures and the natural horizon reflects the same tradition of encoding celestial knowledge into built form that appears at other Zapotec sites. What researchers studying Yagul's observatory function have focused on is the way the stone construction mediates between the human observer and the sky. You are not simply standing in an open field, watching the sun rise. The architecture frames the event. It tells you where to stand, and when, and what to look for. That framing function of the stone is what the Selka classification is tracking here. The lesser-studied astronomical orientation evidence at Yagul represents a use of stone that is neither purely defensive, nor purely residential, nor purely ceremonial in the conventional sense. It is instructional. The stone is arranged to teach, or more precisely to preserve and transmit, a specific body of knowledge about the sky and its relationship to time, agriculture, ritual, and political authority. Because astronomical knowledge in Mesoamerican cultures was not a purely intellectual pursuit. It was power. The ability to predict the movements of the sun and Venus and the timing of the rainy season was the ability to coordinate planting, to time rituals, to legitimate the authority of rulers who presented themselves as mediators between the human world and the celestial one. The people who controlled astronomical knowledge controlled something essential, and they built that knowledge into stone, so it could not be lost to the death of any individual keeper. The broader Tlacolula Valley contains multiple sites with astronomical orientation evidence, and Yagul sits within that landscape as one node in a larger network of sky-watching architecture. How these sites related to each other, whether there was active coordination among astronomical observers across different communities, or whether each site independently arrived at similar orientations through shared cultural tradition, is a question the evidence doesn't fully answer. There is a structure sitting in the middle of the Sardinian countryside near the small town of Barumani that has been visible on the landscape for roughly 3,000 years. It is not hidden. It is not buried. It sits in open farmland, broad and heavy and unmistakable, built from dark basalt stone, without mortar, without written instructions, without any blueprint that has ever been found. The locals always knew it was there. For a long time, the broader world simply didn't pay attention. That changed in the 1950s, when an archaeologist named Giovanni Liliu led a systematic excavation of the site and pulled back enough of the accumulated earth and debris to reveal the full scale of what had been sitting in plain sight all along. The structure is called Nuraghe Su Nuraxi. In 1997, it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it remains, despite decades of study, one of the most architecturally distinctive and culturally puzzling monument types in all of prehistoric Europe. A Nuraghe and Su Nuraxi is the finest example of thousands scattered across Sardinia, is a type of stone tower unique to the island. The word itself is ancient, possibly pre-Indo-European in origin, which is itself a clue about the depth of the culture that produced these structures. There are somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 Nuraghe on Sardinia, depending on how you count partial remains. That density is extraordinary. No other region on Earth has anything quite like it. The towers were built primarily during the Nuragic period, which runs roughly from 1900 to 700 BCE, though the culture that built them persisted in various forms well beyond that. Su Nuraxi is among the oldest and most complex of the surviving examples, with a central tower that dates to around 1700 BCE and a surrounding bastion and village that developed over subsequent centuries. The central tower at Su Nuraxi rises to about 15 meters today, though it was almost certainly taller in its original form. It was built using a technique called Cyclopean masonry, large irregular stones fitted together without mortar in a way that relies entirely on the weight and geometry of the stones themselves for structural integrity. The interior of the tower contains corbelled chambers stacked vertically, connected by internal staircases cut into the walls. The construction is sophisticated in a way that is easy to underestimate when you're looking at it from the outside. From the outside, it looks like a very large pile of dark stone. From the inside, it is a carefully engineered vertical space that has held its form for nearly 4,000 years. What was it for? That question has generated a substantial body of research and a range of competing answers. The defensive interpretation is the most straightforward. The towers are tall, they have commanding views of the surrounding landscape, and their thick walls would have made them extremely difficult to attack with the technology available during the Bronze Age. But defense alone doesn't account for the density of nuraghe across Sardinia, many of which are positioned within sight of each other in patterns that suggest a coordinated territorial network rather than individual fortifications. Some researchers have proposed that the towers functioned as chieftains' residences, combining defensive, administrative, and ceremonial functions in a single structure. Others have focused on the intervisibility between towers, suggesting a signaling network that allowed rapid communication across large distances. The village that grew up around Su Nuraxi adds another layer to the interpretation problem. Excavations revealed a complex of round stone huts surrounding the central tower and its bastion, with evidence of metalworking, food storage, and what appears to be communal activity spaces. This was not a fortress with a small garrison. It was a community organized around the central tower in a way that made the tower both a practical and a symbolic anchor for daily life. The Nuragic people left no deciphered written language. Their beliefs, their social organization, their understanding of the towers they built with such consistency and care across an entire island, all of it has to be reconstructed from material evidence alone. Bronze figurines found at Nuragic sites show warriors, athletes, priests, boats, and animals, offering fragmentary glimpses of a visual culture that was clearly rich and varied. But the figurines raise as many questions as they answer. What is clear, at Su Nuraxi specifically, is that the stone was chosen and placed with intention at every stage of the structure's long development. Each addition to the original tower reflects a community that understood what it had inherited and chose to build on it, rather than replace it. 3,000 years of Sardinian wind have not moved a single stone out of place. That is not luck, that is knowledge, built in. There is a site in the highlands of Ecuador, sitting at roughly 3,200 meters above sea level in the Cañar province, where the wind comes off the Paramo grasslands in long, cold sweeps, and the sky feels closer than it should. The site is called Ingapirca. Most people who know it at all know it for the Inca construction at its center, an elliptical stone platform called the Temple of the Sun, built with the fitted stone precision that the Inca are famous for, oriented to catch the light of the solstice sun in specific and deliberate ways. That structure gets the photographs, It gets the guidebook descriptions. It anchors the site's identity in the popular imagination as an Inca monument. But Ingapirca is not simply an Inca site, and the lesser structures surrounding that central platform tell a story that is, in certain respects, more complicated and more revealing than the temple itself. Before the Inca arrived in this part of the Andes, the Cañar region was home to the Cañari people, a distinct culture with their own language, their own traditions, and their own long relationship with this specific landscape. The Cañari had been building at and around Ingapirca before the Inca expansion reached them in the latter half of the 15th century. When the Inca incorporated the Cañari into their empire, they did what the Inca characteristically did. They built on top of, alongside, and in dialogue with what was already there. The result at Ingapirca is a physical layering of two distinct architectural traditions occupying the same hilltop, which is what makes the lesser structures so significant to the Selkirk stone settlement analysis of this site. The Inca construction at Ingapirca is immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with sites like Machu Picchu or Ollantaytambo. The stones are cut with extraordinary precision, fitted together without mortar in joints so tight that the blade of a knife cannot be inserted between them. The elliptical platform is the clearest example of this at the site, and its solar orientation has been confirmed through archaeoastronomical study. The structure is aligned so that during the June solstice, sunlight enters specific openings and illuminates the interior in ways that cannot be accidental. The Inca understanding of solar movement and their ability to encode that understanding in stone construction is well documented across their empire, and Ingapirca is a clean example of that tradition applied at the empire's northern edge. The lesser structures are different in character. Some of them reflect Cañari construction methods, less precisely fitted, using locally available stone in ways that prioritize function over the geometric perfection the Inca prized. Others appear to represent hybrid construction, where Inca and Cañari techniques are visible in the same building, suggesting a period of transition or collaboration between the two traditions. Rectangular enclosures, storage facilities, and what appear to be residential structures are distributed across the hilltop in a spatial arrangement that researchers are still mapping and interpreting. Some of these structures have been excavated, many have not. What the lesser structures reveal, when examined as a group, is that Ingapirca was a functioning community and administrative center, not simply a ceremonial site. The Inca used it as a tambo, a way station along the royal road system that connected the empire from what is now Colombia to central Chile. Travelers, soldiers, and goods moved through this high Andean hilltop. People lived here, worked here. The lesser structures are where that daily administrative and residential life was conducted, while the Temple of the Sun anchored the site's ceremonial identity. The Cañari dimension of Ingapirca is the part that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Archaeological work at the site has identified Cañari ceramics, burial practices, and construction elements that predate the Inca period and establish this hilltop as a place of significance long before the empire arrived. The Cañari relationship with Ingapirca was not erased by the Inca presence. It was complicated by it, absorbed into it, and in some ways preserved by it, because the Inca chose to build at a place the Cañari already considered important. That pattern should feel familiar by now. It has appeared at nearly every site in this series. Sacred ground accumulates. Cultures arrive, find something already there, and choose to add their own layer rather than start fresh somewhere else. Why? Is it purely practical? These hilltops and riverbanks and cliff faces were simply good locations that independent cultures kept recognizing as such? Or is something else being transmitted across generations, some understanding of place that persists even when the people who first held it are gone? Ingapirca sits at 3,200 meters and offers no easy answers. In 2011, a team of Chinese archaeologists working in the Shanxi province of northern China began to fully reckon with something that had been sitting in plain sight, partially misidentified, for years. A large earthen mound in the Mu-Us Desert region, long assumed to be a remnant of the Great Wall's later construction phases, turned out to be something else entirely, something considerably older and considerably stranger. What emerged from systematic survey and excavation was the outline of a massive walled city built primarily from stone, dating to roughly 2,300 to 1800 BCE. The site is called Shimao, and in the years since that initial reckoning, it has forced a quiet but significant reassessment of what was happening in northern China during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, a period that, in the standard historical narratives, was not supposed to contain anything quite like this. The scale of Shimao is the first thing that demands attention. The outer wall of the settlement encloses an area of approximately 4 square kilometers. The inner walled zone, a step pyramid structure at the site's heart that rises to about 70 meters in its current eroded state, crowns a natural stone outcrop that was shaped and built upon with deliberate and sustained effort over what appears to have been several centuries. The pyramid-like structure at the center, archaeologists refer to it as the palatial zone, contains evidence of elite residence, ritual activity, and craft production of considerable sophistication. Jade objects, turquoise, painted murals, and what appear to be the remains of human sacrifice have all been documented at the site. The combination is striking. This was not a simple defensive enclosure or a seasonal gathering point. Shimao was a city with all the complexity that word implies. The stone walls themselves are the focus of the Selcha stone settlement classification here, and they are worth examining in some detail. The walls were not built casually. They incorporated a system of bastions, projecting sections that allowed defenders to observe and engage threats along the wall's face, that appears sophisticated enough to suggest either independent development of advanced defensive architecture or contact with traditions that had already worked through those design problems elsewhere. The stone used in the construction was quarried locally from the same rocky terrain that the site occupies, and the builders clearly understood how to select and place stone for maximum structural effect. Sections of the wall have been excavated to reveal internal construction techniques that include the use of fill materials packed between stone faces, a method that increases stability and was used in various forms at fortified sites across Eurasia during broadly similar periods. But the walls at Shimao contain something that goes beyond engineering. Excavators found, embedded within the foundation layers of the Eastern Gate area, a collection of human skulls, dozens of them, arranged in pits in a pattern that does not appear random. The prevailing interpretation is that these represent foundation sacrifices, rituals conducted during construction to consecrate or protect the walls. Similar practices are documented at other ancient sites across different cultures and geographies, which is itself an interesting pattern. But the scale and organization of what was found at Shimao suggests a ritual program of some deliberateness, not isolated acts. Someone planned this. Someone decided how many and where and when. The question of who built Shimao and what happened to them is genuinely open. The site does not fit neatly into the known cultural sequences of the region during this period. Some researchers have proposed connections to the later cultures of the Yellow River Valley. Others point to similarities with steppe cultures to the north and west. The jade and turquoise objects found at the site indicate long-distance trade or exchange networks reaching well beyond the immediate region. Shimao was not isolated. It was connected to something larger. The exact nature of those connections is still being traced. What happened to Shimao is also unresolved. The city appears to have been abandoned around 1800 BCE after several centuries of occupation. There is evidence of burning at the site, and some researchers have interpreted this as evidence of violent destruction. Others argue the burning was localized, and the abandonment was more gradual. The subsequent history of the region does not show a clear successor culture that claimed Shimao as an ancestor site, which leaves the city's legacy somewhat suspended. Impressive, documented, and genealogically orphaned in the historical record. A walled city of 4 square kilometers, rising from the Mu-Us Desert, built by people whose descendants we cannot confidently name. The stone walls stood for centuries before they fell. There is a place in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, at an elevation of about 2,900 meters, where the snow stays on the ground for most of the year and the wind is a constant physical presence. In that high, exposed place, someone arranged stones in a pattern on the ground, a central cairn, a circle of stones extending outward from it, roughly 25 meters in diameter, and from that central cairn, 28 stone lines radiating out like the spokes of a wheel toward the outer ring, with 6 smaller cairns positioned at specific points around the circumference. No walls, no roof, no shelter of any kind, just stones, placed with care on the roof of a Wyoming mountain at an altitude where the growing season is measured in weeks and the weather can turn life-threatening with very little warning. This is the Bighorn medicine wheel. It is one of the most studied and most debated stone arrangements in North America. And despite well over a century of formal research, beginning with the first systematic documentation by the anthropologist S.C. Sims in 1903, the full picture of what it is, who built it, when, and precisely why, remains stubbornly and fascinatingly incomplete. The dating question alone is complicated. There is no organic material embedded in the stone arrangement itself that allows direct radiocarbon dating of the wheel's construction. Estimates based on associated artifacts, oral traditions, and comparative analysis have placed its origin anywhere from several hundred to over 1,000 years ago. The most commonly cited range among researchers puts the primary construction phase somewhere between 1200 and 1700 CE, though some elements may be older. The Crow people, whose traditional territory includes the Bighorn Mountains, have oral traditions connected to the site, and multiple other plains and mountain peoples consider it significant within their own cultural frameworks. The National Historic Landmark designation the site received in 1970 acknowledged its importance without resolving the questions about its origins. The astronomical dimension of the Bighorn medicine wheel is where much of the modern research focus has concentrated, and it is where the most specific and testable claims have been made. Beginning in the 1970s, astronomer John Eddy conducted a detailed study of the wheel's geometry and its relationship to celestial events. What he found was that several of the cairns positioned around the outer ring align, when viewed from specific positions, with the rising and setting points of the sun at the summer solstice. Other alignments he identified correspond to the heliacal rising, the first appearance above the horizon after a period of invisibility of three bright stars, Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius. These stellar events, Eddy argued, could have served as a practical astronomical calendar, marking the beginning and end of the short, high-altitude summer, the timing of important ceremonial gatherings, or the coordination of hunting activities tied to seasonal animal movements. Those findings have been both supported and challenged in the decades since. Some researchers have replicated and extended Eddy's work, finding additional alignments that strengthen the astronomical interpretation. Others have raised methodological concerns, pointing out that with a structure containing 28 spokes and 6 peripheral cairns, the number of possible alignment combinations is large enough that some significant-looking alignments may be coincidental rather than intentional. That debate has not been fully resolved, and it probably cannot be resolved through astronomical analysis alone. What the oral traditions of the peoples connected to this site offer is a different kind of evidence that formal archaeology has historically been slow to integrate but is increasingly taking seriously. The Crow name for the site and the stories associated with it convey an understanding of the wheel's purpose and significance that does not map neatly onto either the purely astronomical interpretation or the purely ceremonial one. It is both, and possibly more than both, in ways that the categories available to outside researchers don't fully capture. The Selka stone settlement framework positions the Bighorn medicine wheel as one of the clearest examples in this series of stone used not to enclose or elevate or defend, but to mark, to inscribe meaning onto landscape at a scale and in a location that required deliberate effort to reach and maintain. The mountain doesn't make this easy. Getting to the wheel in the months when it's accessible requires real physical commitment. That commitment was apparently considered worthwhile, repeatedly, across generations. 28 spokes, 6 cairns, 1 central point. The geometry is simple enough to describe in a sentence. Understanding what it meant to the people who built it and returned to it across centuries is a different matter entirely. From a cliff face in Iran to a windswept mountain in Wyoming, from a subterranean world beneath Malta to a jungle city in the Colombian highlands, from the deserts of northern China to the valley floors of Oaxaca. What connects these places is not geography. It is not the civilization that built them. It is something quieter than that and more persistent. Stone chosen deliberately. Stone placed with knowledge. Stone used to say something that the builders understood might need to outlast them. And here is what stays with you after all 11 sites. Not one of these cultures knew the others existed. They were separated by oceans, by centuries, sometimes by millennia. And yet the impulse was the same. Mark this place. Build it to last. Make the knowledge physical so it cannot be forgotten. Maybe that tells us something about what human beings are. At the core, when the noise falls away, we find a place that matters, and we build. If this documentary series is something you want to see continue, more sites, more questions, more stones, with stories still locked inside them, subscribing to the channel is the most direct way to make that happen. We appreciate every single one of you watching.